The laboratory Arago is best introduced through the marine station of Roscoff, because that's where zoology professor of the Sorbonne, Henri de la Casse-Dutier, starting at the 1850s, he was taking students to the seashore for collecting, dissecting animals, and doing this as part of the zoology teaching. The attraction to the seashore was a sort of fashion also, almost at the middle of the 19th century, for the simple reason that with all the activities of ocean-going nations, collections, who had been a sort of hobby of well-to-do people to begin with, collecting plants and animals, fancy animals in the colonies and so on, had become more and more matter of public education. It had become really part of the educational program to go to the sea, to collect animals, to observe animals. And at that time, all the zoologists and botanists to some degree also had one problem. When they went to the sea, they were what we would now call tourists. There were no institutions on the seaside. And as far as the zoology is concerned, this has been termed later on the hotel zoology. People were collecting animals, brought them back in buckets filled with seawater, and trying to keep them somewhere until they had made the sketches and taken notes and finally preserved them in alcohol or in formalin. And this was a sort of untidy business. And there are many interesting stories about the little war between landlords and collecting marine biologists. So it became a necessity to have a home on the seaside. And the first homes created on the beach somewhere were in the 1850s. In France it was Concarneau, 1853 if I remember correctly. This became the way out of this very complicated lifestyle of the hotel biologist, who always had to get around the regulations of the guest house or the hotel. And it became so much sort of necessity that all around the world, starting in the 1850s, there were creations of such institutions. From the 60s on, 1860s, this became a more and more regular sort of trend. And there was a man very well known in the Mediterranean, Anton Dohrn, who had learned how to build aquaria, sort of traveling aquaria. He could take them apart and ship them to other places, and he learned that in Scotland on a visit on the Scottish coast from an amateur marine biologist who showed him what was possible, what you could do with just glass panels and plates of stone or iron or wooden paneling to build aquaria. And he did that in the Mediterranean. He applied it in the Mediterranean into what we know as the marine station of Naples. And exactly at the same time, Lacastutier, who had been on the Mediterranean coast ever since the 1850s, he had decided to create such a station in Roscoff in Brittany. And as soon as the railroad was brought down to the area of Perpignan and pushed further down, he then went into creating another station on the coast of French Catalonia. He looked around. He had an offer in Port-Vendre from the Navy. He was interested and had already sort of accepted that offer. And when the town council of Banyuls got information about le professeur Lacastutier building a lab in the old fortification in Port-Vendre, there was a great surge of enthusiasm, and the Banyuls town council decided, we want to attract the science to our place. And they made just a better offer. And they offered the ground to build just free, to build the lab on. They offered 20,000 francs to help building, plus a substantial sum of money, I don't remember exactly how much it was, a sort of pension over, I think, 10 years to help run the aquarium and the lab. So Lacastutier said, yes, thank you, I buy it. And that's how he finally built the lab in Banyuls, across the bay on an empty lot. In 1965, I spent 6 months in Banyuls for my PhD work. I had a big room, a lab room at my disposal, but I was told that I would have to share this room with other colleagues and with a certain Jean Pinlevé, who would come in summer to film the material I was working on, because he was on a film on the embryogenesis of octopus. Aristotle did a lot of descriptions in his Historia Animalium. You find very detailed observations.
Pieuvre, poulpe, animal horrifique.
Well, pulp comes from polypus, the many-legged. But there are octopus species who can autotomize their arm, or any arm, close to the base. All arms being autotomized can be regenerated. And grown-up octopus, which you find in the field, with all the arms intact, very likely has 1 or 2, maybe 3 arms regenerated, and you don't realize it. So when they walk along, for example, the first 2 are rather the antennae-like sensors. When they settle down and start searching food, then it's mostly the lateral arms going under stones or blocks searching for food, and doing a blindfold search because the animal does not see at that moment what the arm touches. So then if the arm with the local nervous centers decides this is interesting to touch, tastes good, because at the base of each sucker there is a little nervous center. The sucker is a world in itself. It is soft in contrast to the suckers of squids and cuttlefish. It has all the necessary elements of a sucker to do partial vacuum with the ring musculature and so on, but it can also fold. Crab legs can be grabbed by folding around. Only an octopus sucker can do that. The cuttlefish or squid suckers cannot do it because they are reinforced with a chitinous ring. There are species-specific sets of patterns. They are genetically fixed. The animal has to get away with what it has in its program of phenotypic expressions. What happens when you put an octopus on a checkerboard? It cannot imitate a checkerboard. It will probably go into a sort of mottled in-between pattern with some spots and dark parts and light parts of the skin. That's the closest it can get to a checkerboard pattern. Now, the effect of such a pattern to an observer, be it a potential predator or a potential prey, taking the advantage of seeing the potential predator, that's the next step. That is then a matter of light intensity, visual acuity on the side of the observer. Also the question whether the observer, say a fish, can see colors. Octopus cannot see colors. And that is one of the great surprises to most people interested in octopus, is that the octopus, having such an elaborate program of color expressions, is not able to see colors. It has an eye as perfect as ours. The eyelid helps in accommodating to light intensity. So it opens when the light is low and it closes when the light is intensive. And that gives the animal a more intelligent aspect when the slit pupil is rather closed. Is really shaped to transfer spermatophore to the female. And it is a very elaborate machinery, I must say, because the spermatophore, which is a filiform, elongate, just a sort of plastic bag, very skinny plastic bag, is introduced at the base of the arm into a gutter. And then it is pushed forward with peristaltic contractions to the end of the arm, the copulatory arm, which is introduced into the mantle cavity of the female and into the sexual opening. And it is introduced into the oviduct. And some way down that traveling, the spermatophore sort of explodes. It turns inside out, and the sperm is then concentrated in a bubble-shaped bag. And then the whole thing is called a spermatangium. The spermatophore turns into a spermatangium, and from that bubble-shaped spermatangium, somehow the spermatozoids get out and are stored in a special structure, the oviducal gland. Now, the whole mechanism of transfer from the spermatangium to the oviducal gland is still unknown.
Ils sont stockés et fécondent les œufs lorsque la femelle pond. Ces œufs sont attachés à un cordon central qu'elle fixe au toit de son nid. La ponte d'une trentaine de cordons peut totaliser jusqu'à 500 000 œufs. Pendant le mois que dure leur évolution, la femelle ne quitte pas son repaire, ne mange pas, ne cesse de triturer les œufs avec ses tentacules, de faire circuler l'eau à jet, assurant ainsi la respiration à travers les coques et la propreté de celles-ci.
Octopus vulgaris will not go into a new cycle. It's a long, slow end. In general, the cephalopods have just one cycle with more or less extended reproductive period in the end. Egg mass is really having something deserving the term architecture. The string of eggs produced by an octopus female is sort of the stalks of the chorions are knitted together like a hair. They are soft, and there is a sort of gluing cement, really gluing it together. This cement is the product of part of the oviducal gland, and we can be fairly certain now that this is the homologue, really, of the outer case of eggs like the Rosia egg. So it's limited to this stalk. Mm-hmm. And the function clearly is to hold these stalks together and to provide finally a little something allowing the animal to stick the whole string to the ceiling of the den. What was absolutely new and surprising to me was to be introduced to the early phase of embryonic development, because that was part of what Jean Painlevé was filming. The development of the early blaster disc, which covers like a cap, grows over the yolk mass, which remains undivided, until this cap or bell-shaped embryo closes down at the opposite end of the elongate egg. And from then on, it is what becomes visibly an organism in the state of being formed, so what we understand under the term of morphogenesis. My remit was to describe the embryonic development of the circulatory system of octopus. And I was not very interested in the beginning on the very early phases of blastulation, gastrulation. I was interested in the phases once the embryo takes shape. But really what I learned from looking also at the film documents Jean Painlevé showed me from the beginning and explained what he had seen and asked questions of what could be done better, I learned a whole new chapter I had never expected to learn. I heard the name of Jean Painlevé through Pio Fieroni, who had collaborated in this film project. And ever since I believe that the film had been finished in a first version in '58, because Fieroni and Portman, they always cited l'embryogenèse de la pieuvre Octopus vulgaris with all the names Jean Painlevé, Marcus Fonorelli, Pio Fieroni, Adolf Portman, with the year 1958 on it. What I had not realized that Painlevé never considered this document as finished. It was a sort of working copy, and he continued. Now this was 7 years later when I had my first contact with Painlevé and that film project. So it was a never-ending work in progress. But I clearly realized he was doing something more elaborate on the project. I only recently realized that it is not in the filmography of Jean Painlevé, this film. For me, it was a document, of course, that was much more interesting than anything I had seen before, because it showed me these early phases of embryonic development I had not so far been even interested in. And the most impressive part to me was the movement, the autonomous movement of the yolk mass. No textbook had ever even mentioned the fact that the yolk mass was going through a regular sequence of torsional twisting movements. The question of how Painlevé came to do this research film of octopus embryogenesis, I remember that Marcus Fonorelli told me that at one point in his project he had already started under the supervision of Portman on this project of what was at that time called the project of blastocinèse de la pieuvre. Portman had realized earlier on that the whole embryo of octopus changes position inside the envelope. In octopods, the only embryonic envelope is the so-called chorion. It's a transparent membrane which is elongate and has a stalk on one side, so you can easily orientate it visually to know what is close to which part. The micropyle, where the spermatozoid comes in during fertilization, is at the pole opposite to the stalk, and under the micropyle the embryo begins to form with segmentations, cleavage, and the blastulation and so on. Later on, at a stage when the whole envelope has formed over the undivided yolk, the whole embryo shifts over to the opposite pole. But it is not going straight from point A, the micropyle, to point B, the base of the stalk. It is doing a rotation, a slow rotation, but which you are able to follow directly without using any technological trick like time lapse. You just have to sit patiently on your microscope, and then you see that very slowly but visibly the whole embryo rotates around its elongate axis. And then you realize, looking hours on end and from time to time again, that the whole embryo becomes sort of in a slanting position, and then it has no longer its longitudinal axis coinciding with the long axis of the chorion, but this personal axis, if I may say, of the embryo shifts to an angle of about 90 degrees, and you have a sort of very laterally elongated embryo, and so on, until the whole embryo has shifted over to a position which is opposite, 180 degrees opposite to what it had started on. The next question to really find out how this rotation, the regular rotation of the embryo, was achieved. The twisting movements and the subsequent movements of shifting could have something to do one with the other, but as far as I can see now in retrospect, I doubt it. This was the point of departure for the project of von Orelli, because at that time there was the idea that in octopus embryos there could be something similar to what was known from insect embryos. And in insect embryos this was called blastokinesis or blastokinesis, la blastocinese. And Portman was very intrigued about this process and wanted to see more of it, and as he was a very busy university professor in Basel, he always managed to get young scientists who had finished their PhD to do a special project under his guidance. And Marcus von Orelli, who was entomologist, so from that side he was interested, potentially interested in the subject. He was hired and got a salary to do this research project. And I remember that Marcus von Orelli told me that at some point when he had started with this project and did not see how he could go any further, Portman uttered something like, "Now we probably need Jean Painlevé." Jean Panevé was the person to be able to improve the visibility of the whole process. To me, photography is, in the first place, for myself, to be sure of what I have seen. Drawing comes just after that as a means of communicating what I have seen to the reader of a scientific paper I write. Jean Panevé was the eternal tinkerer. He did not trust the power system, which in fact was not trustworthy, and we had many power breaks many times, and so he had his camera and light system always plugged on batteries. In fact, there were car batteries put in series. So he was safe on that. He had calculated how much time he had, and so that was his safety system. Now, for the optical tools, he was not very demanding. I remember once he started setting up his camera system and he saw an old Stiasny microscope sitting on the window bench. I used it for the sort of untidy, splashy work with seawater, which you normally keep away from your good microscope. And this old Stiasny was a wonderful thing. You could take it apart. It was all with a sort of clip-on system, and you easily took it to pieces. And he asked me, could I use your Stiasny microscope? It's exactly what I need. He said, yes, of course, please help yourself. And then he took it and set up his system with a special objective lens he screwed on. And before he screwed it on, he showed it to me and said, now look, this is a lens I take with me wherever I go. It is as precious as my eyeball. I don't find anything like that now in any shop. It is a minimal enlargement system. I think it was, in fact, it was a lens of no enlargement at all. He said, it is so precious, I don't even dare to take it apart, although I should take it apart because there's a little mushroom inside which is visible in the frames, but I'm afraid to ruin the whole thing. So I rather tolerate my little shadow in the corner of my frames, knowing it's my mushroom. And he never took it apart. And well, to me this was a wonderful lesson, because as a young chap, of course, I always thought the better the microscope, the more modern the equipment, the better the scientific work. No, the lesson to me was, well, whatever you do, do it with the simple things you can get hold on, and don't believe in the fancy equipment. Important lesson to a young student.